talked about the importance of youth. We've talked about reaching out to kids. One way that I would propose is using the American persimmon, okay? And persimmon's still there, it's very common. I'm not gonna talk a ton about identification. I'll admit that's usually safely and reliably available on the internet, but you wanna look for that big, thick, blocky bark. That's a good indication. The other thing is, persimmons come ripe usually, and I'll talk about this, in the later part of the year. So, you know, if you see this type of fruit on the ground, there's not much else that looks like, you know. They always say, you know, with foraging or wild plants, you want to learn from somebody that's ate it themselves. That's a golden rule, but the point is that helps a lot. So as I've mentioned, to reach out to kids, I want to talk a little bit about persimmons, some of the things that I've seen as an amateur orchardist, and we planted the orchard in 13. And so from those, you know, mid shin high seedlings, as expected, we started having fruit in about 3 to 4 years, so about 16. And we've had a good supply of American persimmons since, thankfully. So some experience, I would say, you know, if someone asked me, I'd say advanced beginner or early novice, but, you know, I'm sure there's other people in here that have had decades. But again, it's about just maybe putting 1 or 2 things in your toolkit from some of the mistakes. One neat thing about the American persimmon that I think that we should all be thankful for, as I was researching this, I knew some of this, but I didn't know how much. It has the largest fruiting range for a fruiting tree of any tree in North America. You know, and you think about, let me break that down a different way. How many times at the grocery store do you see, hey, these are Vermont peaches? Yeah. Or, you know, how about, you know, these are cherries from Miami? Yeah, if you know anything about plants, you know, you may, even if you don't know, you know you don't see that. And that's because they don't have the range. A persimmon, amazingly, there are different varieties of persimmons that can go basically from what we call a plant hardiness zone, or how much cold the plant has to take, from the warm parts of zone 3, which is basically northern Vermont. You know, we're talking like down to 25 below, 30 below zero. And the persimmon is still kicking it out, fruit, up to northern Florida. So basically zone 9, which is basically maybe every so often it'll get down to 30, maybe. That's a huge range. And I think that's probably the creator trying to tell us something that, you know, this is a tough, strong tree. It's here for a reason. We should avail ourselves of it and honor it, because that's a huge range. The other thing that I found even more fascinating is that different varieties of persimmons, and regardless of the climate, they will shed fruit, depending on what variety or cultivar you work with, from late August, yes, late August. You don't have to wait till the end, from late August until basically New Year's. Yeah, you know, that's a lot. That's a long time. And so, you know, if you did enough research and worked on your plant zones enough, you could probably have a persimmon, you know, orchard that pretty much probably from the first college football game in late August, when you're fighting the heat and humidity, through October, November, Thanksgiving, and right up to New Year's, you could still be having fresh fruit. That's amazing. And we should pay attention to that. That also means, conversely, that you, in your community, you'll probably have a good chance of incorporating the youth to enjoy this fruit. It's not like we're just picking them a certain variety. It's not like we're just picking it at one day or something where everything rots so fast. So here's a common thing that confuses people. Persimmons technically have 5 sexes. Yeah. There's male plants that produce female flowers. And again, I'm not a plant geneticist, but this helps. I'll get in a second about how this leaves a lot of frustration. There's female plants that can produce male flowers. There's plants that are just female with female flowers, and male plants that just have male flowers. And then there's occasionally a perfect tree, and perfect meaning that it has male and female parts that are self-fertile. Not common, but it happens. Also, many persimmons will still produce fruit, but they just won't be fertilized and have a seed. We call that plant terms, partenocarpy. And this is one of my take-home points, because I hear many people say, I know such and such a tree, but it doesn't produce every year. Or, you know, I didn't hold my tongue right, or maybe I did something wrong with the soil. I didn't have a crop this year. I'm going to talk about the varieties, but this is one of the reasons it can be tough. And my take-home point here for everybody is that it's probably going to be worth it to go to a reputable nursery. And my definition of that in the internet age is, or anybody can put out a shingle, is you want someone that's been in business over 25 years. And there's a lot out there. It's not hard to find. But I would encourage you to seek a reliable source and then use perhaps seedlings from them, okay? Now, you can certainly use seeds and everything, but again, you may get that same phenomenon because you got to get sexes and all of that. Maybe you get a perfect plant, maybe not. But I think this leads to a lot of frustration about persimmons and their inconsistency. You know, for even at nursery trees now are expensive, but you can, for 40 or 50 bucks, you can get a very reliable tree that you know will work for you. And because you, again, you want to incorporate the youth, but remember I said from the time you plant it, it may be 3 years until you get any fruit. You know, it's a slow game. You got to meet the tree on its terms. And for us to get going to the youth, then we've already lost 3 years in growing the plant in terms of reaching out. So you want to make sure that it's a reliable plant. So that is something that I think is important. With that take-home point, very quickly, just for a break, really quick, I did want, it wouldn't be an Indian event without some sort of giveaway. And I wanted to just quickly honor, I made it very quick, but I wanted to honor the 3 tribes that did participate with the Native Ethnobotany project. So Mr. Greg, come up here real quick. Yeah, come on, real quick. I know this is a little bit disjointed, but that spirit of sharing. And Mr. Greg with the Kahari people, as you all know, they press sorghum. And sorghum, you know, originally is from Africa. But the thing that's so good about sorghum is that any rural community, it brings them together. It takes a community to get that syrup. Am I not right?
Right.
That's right. So in the spirit of that, Mr. Greg, and that take-home point, through the wonder of the internet, I have a book written by a good Kentucky lady who was growing up with sorghum, and I hope she'll give inspiration and recipes so that we can incorporate that rural community building to all cultures, especially our Indian communities. And secondly, again, Pearl here, always go to used bookstores. You never know what you're going to find. I found this old bookstore. This is from the 80s. This is typed. It ain't word processed. And these are from some Kentucky Mountain ladies who assembled, you know how your church homecoming has a church recipe book? They assemble sorghum recipes. So this is an old school, and it's good. You can feel I don't want to appropriate these ladies, but I can tell you, you can tell from reading it, they believe in sorghum. They wanted to help their rural communities, just like it's bringing the Kahari and other communities and other people together. So I wanted to present that sorghum book to you too. And yeah. Quick Pearl, if you want a good rib rub, 1 part sorghum syrup, 1 part mustard, 1 part vinegar. There you go. It'll be great. I've used that for many side of ribs. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
No problem, Greg. So want to commemorate that take-home point with a take-home giveaway. Yeah. So as I mentioned with the persimmons, there's different races or sexes, but there's also 3 different species. See that here. There is a 90 chromosome kaki Asian persimmon. Now these are Walmart persimmons, not to be mean. These can ship. These are from China and Japan and usually from Asia. They are firm, and the way I explain to the people, you can pass them around. The way I explain Asian persimmons, they have the firmness of an apple usually. Even when they're super ripe, they're just barely dental, but they have the taste of persimmon. You can see these. Pass it around just to orient yourself. I'm sure many of you all have seen these. But again, these are ones you commonly see in stores. All persimmons. Another thing to remember. Persimmons are a vocabulary word of the day. Everybody say fugacious. All right, that's the big $10 word for kind of fleeting, like a ghost. It's like it's there, it's not there. I will tell you, all persimmon taste is fugacious. It's always there in the background. We're gonna have some cookies in a second. And this is part of training young people. Remember, like just like the communists took the young kids. Modern food processing is taking our kids' taste buds. I'm gonna say it again. Food processing is taking our kids' taste buds. We have to retrain them. To reinvigorate our youth, we've got to retrain their taste buds. And the persimmon has a hard go of it. I'll give you a comparison. And my kids included, they ain't perfect. You ask any kid nowadays, under 12, what should an apple taste like? I'm gonna tell you what they say. It's that, I'm about to say jacket, but it's that Jolly Rancher green apple taste. They think that's apple, okay? Because, and General Mills knows this, because anything that they want apple flavored, they take that same chemical and spray it into food. And the kid goes, oh, my oatmeal's apple. That ain't apple. That's not an Arkansas black apple that's been sitting on your shelf till December. That's not a wine sap apple. But our taste buds have been hijacked for corporate profit, being honest. And as elders, as older people, we want to train them to fugacious. We want to say, oh, it's fleeting. Gotta be quiet. Gotta be quiet. Gotta listen to your tongue. How do you listen to your tongue? I don't know. Let's find out. You gotta taste that, because the persimmon really, it's strong, but it is strong in its own way. So, and that includes Asian or American persimmons. So as I mentioned, we got the Asian persimmons that are 90 chromosomes, and there's no genetic engineering, no GMO stuff. This is just the way the persimmons are. There's a 90 chromosome Northern North American persimmons. And then there's a 60 chromosome Southern North American persimmons. This is another point where we mend the science to you all today. Many people, they'll say, first thing they'll say when I bring out these persimmons at your table, they'll say, wow, Watson, your persimmons are huge. I'll just smile, and I'll say, thank you. And I'll say, but I've got a trick up my sleeve. And the trick is this, and I want you all to have it. When you get in persimmon land, these larger persimmons, I'm a Southern, it hurts me to say this, but you want Northern North American persimmons. And when I say Northern, the dividing line traditionally, east-west is the Mississippi, and north-south is the Ohio River. So this is why there's so many persimmon festivals and stuff in like Indiana, Illinois, the Amish and Mennonite communities in Western Pennsylvania. You've got these Northern North American persimmons that are used to the deep soils of the rivers there, the loam. And they don't grow super tall. They may be 30 feet, that's a big one. But they yield persimmons this size, which if you're trying to make cookies for your kid, as detailed on the last page there, you could probably get by with 8 or 10 of these versus, again, I'm a Southerner, but these are Southern. These look familiar, Miss Darling? These are Southern American persimmons. Now let me tell you about the Southern persimmon. They have a purpose. One, they may not yield as consistently every year, but two, although they don't produce as large, these are the persimmons that your grandma tells you about, that if you catch them on the right year, the ground is covered. You can ask in North Carolina, I always say, if you want to know about persimmons, ask your deer hunters, okay? Because deer love persimmons in the fall. And the deer hunter may not be able to identify a persimmon tree, but they know where the deer are at, okay? And these trees, the ground will be littered in these little persimmons when they produce. Now, I'll pass those around. Now be careful. They're like many American persimmons, they're real delicate and mushy. Now, I'm biased again, but me and my daughters, we love these the most. We think these actually have a deeper, like a richer taste. That's up to you, but it's still frugacious. But you can imagine it's going to take a bag full of these to make a batch of cookies. But that is a difference, and that's a take-home point. Northern North American persimmons, Southern North American persimmons. Does that make sense, y'all? Well, let me pass it around. That's right. Okay, there you go. Yeah, don't be afraid. There you go. Pass it around. And see, look at the top now. Like if you on your regalia, if you just got a little room on your leggings, you can use this little calyx, okay? There you go. All right. Gotcha. All right. Now, can't talk persimmons here without mentioning the astringency. Because you talk to anybody, and the first thing you say out of persimmon is like you cussed in front of them. They're like, ooh, and they be doing this, ooh, because astringency is not a taste, people. It is a feeling. An unripe persimmon, we love the fruit, but it will suck your mouth out. So here's the tip, and I'll admit, I'm down. I don't keep a tally, but I keep it in my head. Like if I'm outside and I eat 6 persimmons, I'm about 10% incorrect rate. So I'm getting there. But it ain't gonna kill you. You just spit it out. One tip: if you do eat an unripe persimmon, it's a real world tip. The worst thing you can do, you say, "Oh, it's not ripe." You gotta wait. Okay, when you eat a persimmon and sample it, it takes about 7 to 10 seconds to feel the pucker. You bite into it and say, well, it's sort of sweet, but it's okay. Give it 5 to 10 seconds because you'll be like, oh God, I feel it. So then you get your glass of water. Now here's the second tip, real world tip. Can't read this in a book. You got to swish because the worst thing is to get the persimmon skin stuck in your tooth because that happens at least once a year to me. And what happens is, I could be wrong. I think the most tannins, I think the most astringent part is between the flesh and the skin. I could be wrong on that, but I can tell you that little layer under the skin, if you don't get it out of your teeth, it'll knock you out and it'll keep knocking you out. So again, not the end of the world, but just a tip there. But again, I think persimmons, it's nice to have, as I say in the thing, it's nice to have something without a price. The persimmon has said, I'm not going to be shit. You can't scam me at Walmart. I don't have a code. I'll give you a lot of fruit, whether I'm Southern and I'm just periodically drowning the ground, or I'm Northern and I'm there every year with large fruit, but I'm not as tall, I'm not as big a tree. I've got my place. You got to meet me there. And that includes picking me when I'm right. Other tip with astringency. I only like to pick persimmons usually when they're on the ground. Now you had to be careful. This is one reason you probably never see them in stores a lot. Many health departments don't like what they call ground drops. There's always a risk of feces or an animal or something. You can always just pick it and wash it off, okay? But you can pick persimmons off the tree when they're shriveled and very ripe. But I just personally, I think it's more reliable to have them on the ground. One last tip to prevent the chances of you getting a pucker is when you pick, let's say you go out and you pick 5 or 6 on the ground and they're shriveled. Look at your persimmons. These are all very ripe, okay? Because I picked these all off the ground. Further insurance, especially when you're dealing with your kids and you're making a batch of cookies, let's say you pick 8 that day. Put them in a paper bag, something that breathes a little, with a ripe apple or a ripe pear. We call it gassing, because those ripe apples secrete ethylene, which stimulates fruit to ripe. And put that in your fridge for about 3 to 5 days. That will probably get you to a 99 or 100% success rate of not having an astringent persimmon. Between picking ground drops and American persimmon, it's always the uglier it looks, the riper it is. If you're nervous about picking it up because it's about to fall apart, like some of these on your cutting boards, that means you got a good one, okay? You don't want it to be firm and tense because then it's not ready. But the uglier it is, the better. And the further take you from 90 to 100%, put it in that bag with a ripe apple in your fridge for 3 to 5 days. That will help you meet the persimmon at its own and help you have a good product to enjoy that you can't buy. You can't one-click shop it. It's yours to share with your family. All right. All right. So I got about 15 minutes or so. Couple things on the last page. Take back the youth. I've got some cookie recipes. Shameless plug here. I've got some cookies. I encourage you all, if you like plants, to join the North American Fruit Explorers. That's basically a bunch of plant nerds like me. And across all cultures, we've got Hispanic Miami papaya growers and hardcore Norwegian Vermont persimmon growers, everything. But this is on their website too. You join the Fruit Explorers. I think the greatest compilation ever of persimmon recipes was the great Eugene and Mary Griffith. This old book's from '82. Again, go to your used bookstores. And it's literally like 150 pages of persimmon recipes. You take the persimmon that you properly harvest, use the modern recipe to keep your traditions alive, your conversations alive, those talks together. Because you don't know, as we said, from the parents and grandparents in here, we don't know what batch of cookies is going to have an impact. All right, let's mash some persimmons, all right? So let's take out our cutting boards, let's go. And the goal here, I want you to get a feel for a persimmon, okay? Some people here have never seen one, but you know what it is, you've heard what it is, and I don't want you to get non-confident because you're already worried enough about are they ripe enough. So one tip. One tip I'm going to show you with the mushy one. And look, I know skeptics are going to say, big deal, Watson, you just mashed some stupid persimmons. No. Okay, we are meeting a fruit in its way on its terms. We are stepping outside of our demands as humans. That's rare for Western society. And we are stepping into its work. So you take this persimmon, let me give you, look on the end there, you're going to see a little hard pointy stem, real tiny. You think that processing it, cooking it is going to get rid of it? It won't. I've eaten at least 4 of these. So you take your finger and peel that off and just set it aside. That little cuss will get in your way every time. Now then you go to the other pole of the persimmon where the calyx attached. And it's okay if it's a mess. Don't be afraid to get messy with your knife. You see that little ring? There's a little ring that's dark right at the calyx on the skin. You need to take that off too. That little ring, especially if you make a persimmon pie where you can see the flesh, it always shows up and looks up. And you don't want your 4-year-old to say, ew, gross. You got to have a little presentation. So take that little ring off. That little skin is kind of bluish dark. Take that ring off at the calyx and then take off that little stem. Now, some of you all will have seeds in your persimmons and some don't. Now, what you want to do, by now, I see y'all, you're doing great. It's already mashed up and you kind of got the skin on top. Gently pull the skin away. Now, one thing, many times if your recipe involves a lot of chopping of the pulp, you can use the skin too. You're not going to see it probably in like a good, thick, dark persimmon bread or persimmon pudding. But if you just want to make it smoother or better consistency, go ahead and pull away with your knife or finger some of the skin there. And you should be left with a decent mass of bright orange pulp. Okay, now here's another tip. Almost came up short once by 1/8 of a cup. This tip's safe. I've been picking and fighting the possums. Some of you all have seeds. Pull that seed aside. You'll notice it has a tightly adhering sac around it. There's a name for it. I don't know it. You take your napkin and you want to separate that. That is good tasting, even though it's a little more firm. That kind of gelatinous sac is still excellent pulp. And I can tell you, if your persimmons have a lot of seeds, like you have a huge harvest of Southern American persimmons maybe, where like 1/3 of it is seed, you want to get that pulp away from that. And it takes some work to separate. I'll go on and tell you. Do y'all see that? Here, I'm going to hold it up. That gelatinous, it's a little bit lighter when you hold it up. But you take that and separate it out because it adds up, I'm telling you. Because you worked hard for these persimmons. And so what you should be left with is that little stem, that little, thank you, that little halo there. And then the seeds as you separate it out. Now I've heard people say they can use the seeds to make coffee. I'm going to tell you, these seeds will make diamonds break. So don't be fancy and put them in your mouth or anything, okay? But you should separate out the seeds with the seed sac separated. Now I'm going to be honest, I see somebody eating some, that's fine. I did not refrigerate these with the apples because I only have so much refrigerator space. So somebody may be in the 10%. I'm gonna be honest. If you're not, that's good, especially if you had an ugly, mushy one and you thought you got the short end of the deal. You should be good. But I didn't have time to do the 3 to 5 days in the fridge. And then what you want to do with the pulp that's left over, with most of the skin, again, you don't have to get rid of all the skin, but with most of the skin left over, is just gently go through. Occasionally you'll see a seed that's half developed. You can eat that, but it's a little firm. And again, your kids are going to be your worst critic. And you see, here's the thing. My point of pulping these persimmons with y'all is that you're already going to have a little self-doubt. Let's be honest. Even if you eat persimmons, you're going to be a little nervous because you're serving other people, okay? And I don't want you to cower and give up, all right? Not being dramatic. But I want you to get that pulp. And what you want to do is your goal is 1 cup or 2 cups of pulp. And then you put it in your freezer and you can use it anytime for any recipe, which is very convenient. I don't hear too much gum smack. Did I pucker anybody? Okay. I did the best I could getting the ones off the ground. And again, they've been in the freezer. So, I mean, that should have killed the COVID. Never mind, I'm vaccinated 8 ways of sun. So, Lord knows, I'm going to start selling my blood. Yes. Okay, good question. Remember I said persimmons are a beautiful tree. You got fruit from late August. My 2 favorite varieties of northern, I don't have any financial interest in them. My 2 favorite varieties of northern North American persimmons, and you see these at most nurseries, are Prok, P-R-O-K, and Yates, Y-A-T-E-S. These 2 varieties grow quickly, and they typically will start the last week of August. And then they will continue for about 2 to 3 weeks. And that's it. So I pick these mostly around Labor Day. Yeah. Yes, what? Oh, Prok, P-R-O-K, and Yates, Y-A-T-E-S. I will also say, again, no financial interest. Much of the modern persimmon, American persimmon work has been with Amish and Mennonite communities and One Green World. That is a nursery that probably has the results of 2 of the greatest persimmon breeders in modern day, Mr. Claypool and Mr. Lehman, L-E-H-M-A-N. They've planted 10,000 persimmons in between them, and they have worked on having better varieties. My last tip that I'll leave you with, during that 2 and 2.5 weeks when you're harvesting these persimmons, you're going to be fighting possums, deer, raccoons. I almost ended up in the ER last night, a couple nights ago, because there was a 20-pound possum eating my Asian persimmons. I threw a piece of wood at him, it bounced off him, and it growled at me. You can't make this up, people. So, you know, hashtag orchard life. So anyway, when your community has a reliable persimmon tree, I've heard Miss Darlene say they've got a good tree. Greg, down there at the Cattail Tribal Gardens next to the sorghum field are 2 beautiful trees. Hollister, I know you've got at the walking track at the library, the multipurpose building, as you go around the bend away from the library, there is a wonderful persimmon tree. You can see it next to that old fence. In addition, the ethnobotany project has persimmons planted at the Cattail Tribal Center, which are yielding, and also persimmon plants which are at the were given to the Waccamaw, and also they're still alive at the library at the multipurpose building. They're at the walking track. I will say the Haliwa persimmons are growing slower because they're fighting that clay. Now, many old timers say fruit trees grown in clay will ultimately taste sweeter and better, but they grow slow because you can imagine a root trying to dig through that hard clay. It's tough. So that is the other part of my giveaway that I will quickly end on for time. I have the Waccamaw contingency because they love their warnings. I've got them 2 nutcrackers. a pecan cracker, and an industrial strength black walnut cracker. And for my Haliwa contingency, I have an excellent bag, small bag of fertilizer to help those persimmons growing into clay. And I also have a sieve that you can use to pulp persimmons. If you want to try a sieve instead of your hands, 3/16 of an inch is the size. Okay, and you can see the one here I've got. Real quick. Oh, yes.
I just had a couple of comments.
Okay.
Over the last few weeks, I've sold 60 pounds of persimmon full dirt.
Yeah.
So they will have a persimmon here.
Yes.
And under my tree, I set down strips of burlap.
Yes.
So they fall on the burlap and then they're.
Good point.
And
Yes.
one other thing that I've seen persimmon grow in deep swamp, and I've seen them grow in sand dunes at
They're unstoppable if you just stop and look at it. Good point about the burlap. So I've just got orchard grass underneath. One thing, many foraging books will say that when they fall in the fall, bugs don't get them. I can tell you, North Carolina fire ants love persimmons. Okay. One other quick tip. During that 2 weeks, your tree is yielding, whether it's at the Clary Tribal Gardens or the Haliwa Multi-Purpose Building or down in Waccamaw land. Designate a junior high student to say, look, you've got to be systematic about getting these persimmons. You've only got a 2 or 3 week window, and I can tell you, the animals will take it. Here's what you do. You got to be religious about it. You got to believe. At least 4 times a week, you tell that junior high student, your job is to go out to that persimmon tree between 4 and 6 p.m. in the late day. And all the persimmons that have fallen during the day, you get. I always say, let day be day and night be night. The day persimmons are ours. We got to show up though and get it. Because I can tell you, at night, the animals will take it. My Guilford native story that I mentioned. So this fall, when I'm collecting these, trying to get enough for my 2 trees. Guilford native was there and I was off, because you work urgent care, you got a lot of weekends. I was off Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I was like, great kids, load up the car, we'll go and powwow. So I'm mowing that day Friday. By 2 o'clock, I'm done mowing. And as I'm mowing around the trees there in the little orchard, I count 11 persimmons. I was like, oh, I was like, this is huge. I was like, this is great. I was like, I'm going to finish mowing. I'm going to go take these, put them in the freezer. We'll have plenty to pulp. All right, great. I get busy. I realize I haven't packed the kids to Gale yet. I got to go pick up the kids from daycare because I'm leaving straight from daycare to get the Guilford native. And I know there's going to be traffic going from Raleigh to Greensboro. As I'm leaving in the driveway at 4:30, I go, oh no, I forgot the persimmons. I go, that's okay, that's okay. I'm driving back tonight. I'll be back by 11:30 or midnight. Deer, I think the word is crepuscular. They love the sunrise, sunset. Then the rest of the night they lay low, usually. So I was like, okay, I'll beat the morning rush on the deer. I'll beat it. So I drive home, put the kids to bed. My wife says, what the heck are you doing? I was like, I'm going to go on my persimmon walk. She goes, you're crazy. I go, I know, I'm crazy like a fox. And so I go out there, my headlight, and I'm like, all right, here they are, here they are. I'm looking. I'm like, where? Kicking the grass over? Nothing. Finally, I see a little shiny thing. Usually with light, that means there's a persimmon. I go and I turn it back, and it is a steaming pile of deer scat. I mean, it's still hot. Big deer turd right there. And I said, I'm telling you, that's a sign I've got to give this talk. And I've got to tell people, when you're collecting your persimmons that you deserve, that you have stewarded and joined the tree with, you got to claim the day, people. I should have been out there at 4:30 getting in persimmons. And now them deer got my 11 persimmons. But don't let that happen to you. And again, to get the youth involved, get a 4th or 5th grader where they're trying to be old and cool and do something, but they can't really do nothing yet because they can't drive. Say, you're the persimmon keeper. You go out there and you bring them and you put them in the freezer. And so let's see how many you can tally. I mean, sounds odd, but you got to go out there regularly, because if you don't, I've heard Mr. Phillips say it down in Cahary land, we will get some persimmons, but the deer get them. They will get them unless you take the day, at least 4 times a week. Thank y'all. I know I went over time, but I appreciate it. Oh, yes. Thank you
From
for
one
the
of
Zoom question.
From one of the participants from Zoom, you were talking about the significance of persimmon culturally, and there's a lot of sadness that this person believes hindered the discussions amongst the elders who moved. When my grandfather's people moved north, having persimmon brought excitement. I actually have some on my table now. My 11-year-old ate some last night, so that alleviates your fears of the young people not getting these tastes. But could you please talk more about it being utilized, nutritive, medicinal, spiritual, or otherwise, and the symbolism of the resilience it embodies?
Okay, so first, excellent question. I've said it, but I can't emphasize, if you work with fruiting trees, to have a tree that yields this long, basically up and down the eastern seaboard, is a botanical dynamo, okay? And we should not underestimate that. The comment here, from the windswept sands of the Outer Banks to thick clay to basically mountainous stream sides, you've got persimmons, okay? There may be different amounts, but they are there and they're supporting a key role in the ecosystem. Now, on a philosophical and cultural standpoint, this whole process of, for lack of a better term, fighting the astringency, as I've said, meeting the persimmon on its own terms, not my schedule to get off to the powwow, but making my schedule fit it for a select time of year. It's not every day. It's not 365 days a year. But that act is very important. And the fact that it can't be, as I've said, commoditized, made into a commodity that's shipped world over, it kind of reminds you of culture, doesn't it? Culture's hard to ship, at least to be authentic, you can't. There's a lesson there. And I think if we can meet the persimmon for that time in the fall when the tree is yielding and conquer the astringency with a few tricks and get the youth involved, you know, it's nice to be part of. It's just like at the drum. I always say it's important to have something bigger than you. I think Thoreau or Emerson said you should always have something without a price. That's how they phrased it. But, you know, as Indian people, we're okay with saying we don't know everything. We're okay with saying that we don't expect science is going to solve it all. I like the phrase from the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, they say that they call it the great mystery. And we accept that there is always going to be some mystery. And as Indian people, we don't know if we want to be in the world if there ain't no mystery. That's a sad place. A place where faith and the unexplained and just serendipity, things coming together for no reason, you know, that means something. And valuing that in your culture means something. And I would like to say, I think botanically, the persimmon is a representation of that. And as people have gotten busier, as in an engineering Western way, as we try to make nature bend to us, and as we suffer those consequences, I think there's a local lesson there from the persimmons that we can take. Side note, but you know, always the Corps of Engineers with the Mississippi, you look at the tragedy of all the levees and the ecological disaster. And only now, after what, 80 years, is the Corps saying, you know what, maybe nature had it right. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. We can do amazing things, but maybe we should stop and see what nature has already done. And that's what the persimmon wants us to do, is just stop, make sure that fruit is ripe, delay that gratification, keep it in the fridge a few more days, and then enjoy it and share it with others. And isn't it funny, we just heard that nice comment, if Zoom couldn't hear it, about in other cultures using the persimmon dye. And it's fascinating, he said the dye gets stronger over time in clothing. And also I can tell you the persimmon wood is amazingly hard, but flexible. And you see that in the Asian persimmon trees. The wood will be bent at 90 degrees from the weight of those huge half-pound persimmons. And yet it never breaks. I didn't lose a persimmon through Hurricane Matthew. 18 inches of rain, whole night of 40 to 60 mile-an-hour winds. I walked out in my mud boots, and not an American or Jap or Asian fell. So it is an amazing tree, wood-wise, dye-wise, plant-wise, botanically. There's so many things there about the quiet resilience. And it's not a main tree. It's not the oak. It's not the big long leaf. It thrives on the edge or open sun. But you know what? Wherever it goes, it makes the most of it. And that's a good thing. It's kind of Indian that way. Wherever it goes, we make the most of it.